The 80s. The slasher subgenre boomed as it established its conventions and undertones of sexuality. Every slasher film had the same structure. A group of teenagers go to a secluded location where a killer inevitably kills off stereotypes that include but are not limited to the whore, the jock, the social outcast, and the not white person. This leaves the last teenager, who is typically a girl and lacked sexual experience, to face the masked killer. This led to 3 outcomes. The final girl defeats the killer in hand-to-hand combat, the final girl escapes the secluded location, or the police arrive just in time to save the final girl. This obviously does not apply to all slasher films of this decade, but it is the cut-and-dry formula for slashers at this point in film history. Valerie Wee states the outcome of the 80s slasher formula in her journal article titled The Scream Trilogy, Hyper-Postmodernism, and the Late 90s Teen Slasher Film as this. Teen slasher films also originated the trend toward spin-offs, sequels, and imitators, sparking a rash of successful slasher film franchises. With the release of each installment in the series, the conventions of the genre were repeated and consolidated. The growing popularity of these films was in fact tied to the increasing familiarity of these conventions. However, in the late 80s, the growing popularity hit a plateau once audiences realized that there was no variety and that each new entry of a franchise lost quality, typically due to cost-cutting measures. This led horror fans to different subgenres that were booming at the time, like supernatural, crime, thriller, and comedy. Using the 80s slasher formula ad nauseum killed the 80s slasher subgenre. This was until a boy from North Carolina sold his script titled Scary Movie to Miramax's Dimension Films in 1995 for $500,000, $1,050,113.11 in 2024. Kevin Williamson is an openly gay screenwriter and director from New Bern, North Carolina, whose works will forever be in the American pop culture zeitgeist. Scream, formerly known as Scary Movie, was the film that put Williamson on the radars of Hollywood executives and audiences alike. It was a huge success in terms of slasher films, earning $173 worldwide in its run. This led to Williamson earning more opportunities in film like Scream 2, I Know What You Did Last Summer, and The Faculty. Looking at all these films, there are a lot more similarities between them, other than just having Williamson's name attached to them. They are all a part of the self-aware horror movement that has a very particular formula, curated and popularized by Kevin Williamson. The formula builds off of the 80s slasher formula, but updates it for audiences in the 90s. It needed to change not only because audiences were tired of the old formula, but also because America had changed from the 80s to the 90s. In Alexandra West's book titled The 1990s Teen Horror Cycle, Final Girls in the New Hollywood Formula, there is a chapter on the 90s political climate titled They Never Had It So Good, America in the 90s. It does a great job of setting the scene for those of us not alive during the 90s or needed a reminder. One important factor is that the 90s saw the rise of third-wave feminism and the Riot Grrrl movement as a result of the Anita Hill hearings. America's movement away from Reaganism ideals is reflected in slasher films. For instance, Final Girls can have sex and live. This goes along with what Robert Mells wrote in his dissertation, In History, No One Can Hear You Scream, Feminism in the Horror Film, 1974 through 1996. The third wave also brought the focus away from definitions of what was good for women as a whole, and instead attempted to allow each individual to define what was good for them. This allowed Final Girls to have character traits that recently would have sealed their coffins, but now make them more realistic and likable. Since Final Girls can have sex now, it does make the role of the whore obsolete, since women characters are no longer defined by their body count. This new sprout of feminism is crucial for the self-aware horror formula. Williamson's formula is characterized by playing into the stereotypical characters from the 80s, a whodunit mystery that keeps audiences guessing who the killer is, over-the-top gore, earth-shattering and high-stakes finales, satisfying yet ominous endings that leave room for a sequel, and a slew of pop culture references. Like the 80s formula, not all of Williamson's films are going to hit every single point, but these are the factors across his 90s slasher films that set them apart and led to many copycats. Playing into the stereotypes was a way to acknowledge the ridiculousness that was the 80s slasher while having a way for audiences to connect with the characters quickly. Humans love to label things, so these conventions are a must for all of the films. In Scream, these stereotypes also help to keep the characters alive. Randy, played by Jamie Kennedy, is the nerd who brings forth the dire information of how scary movies operate.
Number 1, you can never have sex. Number 2, you can never drink or do drugs. And number 3, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances say, "I'll be right back."
I would also like to add that Scream has 2 final girls. Sidney Prescott, played by Neve Campbell, and Gail Weathers, played by Courtney Cox. This goes along with final girls becoming more feminist because while they do not agree with each other all the time, they are both very active in their plots to find out who Ghostface is. The same is said for Scream 2. They bring back the legacy characters and add more to fill out the cast. However, you still feel like you know these new characters because of how they play into their stereotypes. I Know What You Did Last Summer has a much smaller cast but continues to easily define its characters. Even after the time jump in the film, everyone still falls into their roles. The faculty plays into both high school stereotypes and slasher stereotypes. This is essential since the main plot happens at their school. It helps to define where each character sits in the school hierarchy while also showing the role they play in the slasher once the killings are introduced. To note, the faculty does not have a final girl but instead has a final boy. This is not groundbreaking though, because there had been final boys since there had been final girls. Women cannot have anything for themselves. That was a joke. I'm going to continue to refer to the final person as the final girl because it is more prevalent in this filmography and also because that term is more widely received. Keeping the identity of the killer a secret greatly differs from the 80s slasher. Everyone walked into the theater knowing which superhuman masked killer it was going to be, and that it was only a matter of time before the characters in the film found out too. With the self-aware slasher, it could be anyone, because the killers are realistic in the sense that they can take damage because they are real people. Ben Moontananashat has the idea in his thesis that since the killers are more realistic, that makes them more terrifying because something like the Woodsboro Massacre could happen in real life. This also makes it harder for audiences to figure out who the killer is because no one is ever truly cleared before the climax unless they are killed. The whodunit also goes hand in hand with the blame game. As the characters try to figure out who is terrorizing their town, they point fingers because they can suddenly no longer trust someone they have known their entire lives. Scream popularized this factor. Sydney does not trust her boyfriend, who doubts Randy, who does not trust Stu, and whose girlfriend does not trust the reporter, who is taking advantage of her brother, who is a deputy. The mistrust is interwoven. Scream 2 has the same thing happen, but everyone is trying to move on with their lives because of the events of the last movie. That sadly does not happen because a new environment means new suspects when the killings start again. I Know What You Did Last Summer starts its blame game after Julie gets a note stating that they know what she did last summer. Their old friend group blames each other because they made a pact to never tell anyone about their hit-and-run murder. The faculty keeps audiences guessing by having the mind control alien teachers and students do the killing. They purposefully do not show who started it all, and the protagonists only realize that it could be one of them until it's too late. Slashers are called slashers because of the gore. To keep audiences interested, you have to have bigger and more gory kills. That has been one of the appeals for the slasher since its birth. The issue in the 90s is that audiences were becoming desensitized to the gore because of the 80s slasher. You can only stab someone so many times before audiences become disinterested. Scream starts with Casey, played by Drew Barrymore, and her boyfriend both being gutted, and then she is hanged on a tree outside her home. In West's book, the chapter titled Bowling for Woodsboro, Scream 1996, Scream 2 1997, and Scream 3 2000 have some pretty interesting behind-the-scenes information about the films. One is that the scene where Steve, played by Kevin Patrick Walls, is murdered was heavily edited down to avoid showing his intestines moving from inside his body to outside his body at the request of the MPAA to avoid an NC-17 rating. Some other creative kills to note are a girl getting trapped in the doggy door of a garage door opening, a cameraman getting his throat slashed, and a huge 90s box TV falling on someone's head. Scream 2's kills are even bloodier, with someone getting stabbed in the head through a bathroom stall, his date getting stabbed in the stomach in a theater, a sorority sister being stabbed and then thrown off a balcony, and Randy being taken in broad daylight and pretty much turned into a human slushie with the amount of stab wounds he receives. I Know What You Did Last Summer plays off of the Hookman urban legend, and a hook makes for a gruesome murder weapon. People get hooked from under their chin, in the stomach, across their chest, and impaled several times over. The faculty is an interesting addition since science fiction is introduced into the plot. An alien gets their fingers cut off with a huge paper cutting blade and is stabbed in the eye with a pin, and another gets crushed behind the bleachers. Finales continue the theme of bigger equals better. The higher the stakes, the better the film. The final girls' lives need to be changed with no hope of ever going back to the quiet life they once lived. Finales are important for audiences because the final girl has to have the final show-off with the killer for payoff purposes. We have to know how to defeat the evil. This is also where the reveal of who the killer is happens. In Scream, Sydney is recently and consensually de-virginized by her boyfriend, played by Skeet Ulrich. She watches him get killed by Ghostface, and she attempts to escape out the front door. Randy and Stu, played by Matthew Lillard, are at the front door accusing each other. Sydney shuts the door in their face, and Billy comes tumbling down the stairs freshly stabbed. Sydney helps him up, gives her her gun, and Billy lets Randy in. Billy clips Randy in the shoulder, and he reveals that he faked getting stabbed. Stu comes in, and Sydney runs to him for help, but he is also in on the killings. As they hold her hostage, they reveal that they actually killed her mother a year ago because she was having an affair with Billy's dad, played by C.W. Morgan, which made his mom leave them. They also reveal to have kidnapped her dad, played by Lawrence Hecht, who left for a business trip at the beginning of the film. Their plan is to frame Sydney's dad, kill everyone besides themselves, and play the victims. Gail storms in with a gun, but Billy overtakes her and knocks her out. While Billy and Stu are distracted by Gail and are about to kill her, Sydney and her dad disappear. This alerts Billy and Stu. Sydney begins to tease and torment them by playing Ghostface. Billy goes looking for her but is stabbed with an umbrella as Sydney emerges from the closet. Stu tackles her and they wrestle until Sydney pushes one of those huge 90s box TVs onto Stu's head, killing him. In Scream 2, Sydney is led to her college's theater where she finds her new boyfriend Derek, played by Jerry O'Connell, tied up on some set deck. Ghostface emerges as she tries to untie him, and Ghostface reveals himself to be Mickey, played by Timothy Olyphant. He plays mind games with Sydney as he convinces her that Derek is the other Ghostface. Derek tries to convince her otherwise but fails. Mickey shoots Derek in the chest and mocks Sydney for not trusting her boyfriend. Mickey reveals that his motive is that he wants to get caught so that he will be famous, since there was a diegetic movie based on the killings from the first film called Stab. Sydney attacks him and tries to run away, and a chase ensues until Mickey gets his gun again. Gail emerges with reporter Debbie Salt, played by Laurie Metcalf, following behind her, gun in hand. Sydney recognizes Debbie Salt to be Mrs. Loomis, Billy's mom. Mrs. Loomis and Mickey met on an online psychopath forum, and she paid his tuition so that he can help her with the Ghostface killings. However, Mrs. Loomis double-crosses him by shooting him, and he accidentally fires his gun at Gail's stomach. She falls off the stage. Mrs. Loomis taunts Sydney and reveals that her motive is revenge. Sydney escapes and a chase ensues again. Sydney starts throwing switches and breaking ropes backstage in hope that some set deck will fall on her. It does, but she emerges and they fight some more. Then Cotton Weary, played by Liev Schreiber, who Sydney blamed for the death of her mother in the first movie, and who is only at the college because Gail wanted him and Sydney to work it out on the Diane Sawyer show, shows up with a gun looking for answers. He pretends to be on Mrs. Loomis's side after she reminds him that Sydney sent him to jail for a year until he shoots her. In I Know What You Did Last Summer, Julie, played by Jennifer Love Hewitt, is running away from Ray, played by Freddie Prinze Jr., at a port because she suspects that he is the killer. Ray gets clotheslined by a stranger fisherman character and tells her to hide on his boat. She obliges and goes to the boat, but there are pictures and articles of her and her friends in the captain's quarters. The fisherman walks into his quarters and reveals himself to be the killer and Benjamin Willis, played by Muse Watson. His motive for killing them is that he was the guy they hit in the drunk driving accident a year ago, but right before that happened, he killed the boy that was going to marry his daughter, but killed her in a drunk driving accident. Ray steals a fishing boat to catch up with them and climbs aboard. Ray and Ben fight until Ray is knocked overboard. Julie is trying to hide and Ray comes back onto the ship. The hookman finds her and there is a final fight between Ray, Julie, and Ben. Ben gets his hooking hand caught on some rope and Ray uses the rig to send him flying into the ship's gears. This cuts off Ben's hand and makes him fall into the ocean. In the faculty, Stokely, played by Clea Duvall, and Mary Beth, played by Laura Harris, are sitting in the gym alone when Mary Beth turns into the alien queen as Casey, played by Elijah Wood, runs in, barricading the door because of the mob outside. Casey and Stokely run away, but Stokely is caught and turned into an alien. Casey does not know this and fishes her out of the pool. They hide in the locker rooms. Zeke, played by Josh Hartnett, finds them, but Mary Beth is also hiding in there and tries to convince him that Stokely is the alien queen. Mary Beth is naked, so that gives her away, and she reveals that she faked her alien test. Stokely pounces on Zeke, but Casey traps her with the football storage. Mary Beth turns back into the alien queen and attacks Zeke. She then chases Casey back into the gym and behind the bleachers. The bleachers start to close while Casey is trying to make it to the other end before either the bleachers close in on him or the alien queen catches him. He makes it through and watches the alien queen get crushed. Conclusions and epilogues are important to any story. In slashers, the conclusions play the role of luring audiences into a false sense of security before having one final scare. The epilogues are what promise sequels. They take place after the events of the plot and can sometimes be a dream, a fake-out scene that has nothing to do with the next movie nor is it acknowledged, or they're just a harmless update. In Scream, Randy wakes up alive but is quickly cold-cocked by Billy, who then chokes out Sidney. Gail comes in and shoots him. Gail, Randy, and Sidney stand over his body. Billy has one final scare, but Sidney is unfazed and shoots him in the head. Sidney's dad busts out of the closet and they free him. As daylight breaks, Deputy Dewey, played by David Arquette, is wheeled off into an ambulance and the police sirens sound as Gail gives a news report outside of Stu's house. In Scream 2, Sidney gets the gun from Cotton. Gail is alive and climbs back onto the stage with the assistance of Cotton. Gail, Sidney, and Cotton stand over Mrs. Loomis's body waiting for her to wake up, but Mickey emerges from behind them. Sidney and Gail empty their clips on him and give Mrs. Loomis a just-in-case shot to the head. The next morning, the police and ambulances show up. They check out Gail, and her new cameraman, played by Dwayne Martin, shows up ready to film her news report. Dewey is rolled out on a stretcher because the last time we saw him, he turned a window into an avant-garde painting. He is somehow alive, and Gail goes into the ambulance with him. Sidney is crowded by the reporters and Gail's cameraman, but she redirects them to Cotton in an attempt to make amends with him. He probably needs some good PR after getting falsely accused of murder. The film ends with Sidney walking away. In I Know What You Did Last Summer, Ray and Julie console each other after a crazy night. The boat is docked and police are looking over the scene of the crime. The police fish out the hookman's hand as Ray and Julie onlook. Time jump to a year later and Julie is back at college. She is talking on the phone with Ray in the showers. Her roommate drops off Julie's mail next to her shower items. She hangs up the phone and opens the letter to reveal an invite to a party. A relieved Julie goes back to the showers and written on the condensated glass shower door is, "I still know." The hookman pounces through the glass shower door towards her. In the faculty, after Casey kills the alien mother, he goes to check on Stokely. The alien worms have left her body and died, so she is alright. Zeke scares them, but he is also alright. 1 month later, Zeke is at a football practice and there is an abundance of news reporters talking about the recent events. Casey is on the front pages of magazines for saving the world from aliens and reporters want to talk to him. The high school atmosphere seems to be back to normal as teenagers talk and joke around. Featuring pop culture references in these films was important for several reasons. Since the target audience for these films was young adults, pop culture was a must for realism and to keep them interested. It also helps for critical analyses of these films. If audiences were up to date on their pop culture, then they could understand more about these films. The biggest example of this is Scream and Scream 2 because the foundations of these films are built on these references. I will not be able to talk about all of them, but I will mention a handful. The beginning of the film has Casey being questioned on horror movie trivia while being in a horror movie. She even mentions her favoritism towards the first Nightmare on Elm Street movie, which was directed by Wes Craven, who is directing that movie. Even though horror pop culture is at the forefront, other aspects are referenced as well. For example, the ghost face mask resembles the Scream painting. Scream 2 references specifically slasher movie sequels in a hyper-reflexive way with the classroom scene.
Stab 2? Who'd want to do that? Sequels suck. No, come on, man. Oh, please, please. By definition alone, they're inferior films.
I previously mentioned how I Know What You Did Last Summer is built on the urban legend about the Hookman, but there is a whole scene where the protagonists try to tell different iterations of the same story around a campfire. The faculty references a lot of other alien films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Thing. If you want to get really meta, Williamson's formula is a pop culture reference to 80s slasher films. Each component of this self-aware slasher formula does depend on each other though. The stereotypes are pop culture references that help connect with audiences more easily. When one of those characters die in a gruesomely bloody way, the audiences need to feel something other than indifference. The body count makes the stakes higher for the final girl while she figures out who the killer is. She will figure out who the killer is and have a final show-off where she wins, but there is going to be one final scare. While this seems predictable to us now, it's different and similar enough to the 80s slasher that audiences were intrigued. It was incredibly successful too because it inspired many copycat films. If Kevin Williamson had not revived the slasher when he did, the subgenre could have been in some serious trouble. There will always be requels and remakes, but forming a new slasher icon is not easy when working with the dying subgenre.